There are stories that shake the world, and then there are stories the world tried to bury. This is the tale of a man who rose from the deserts of Libya and dared to challenge superpowers, oil empires, and the very architecture of global domination. A man whose name still echoes across Africa, the Arab world, and every place where people dream of freedom. His death was broadcast to the world, but the truth behind it was not. His legacy was erased, reshaped, and rewritten. But today, we bring his real story to the light. Before we begin, make sure you are subscribed because what you're about to hear is not just history, it is a truth many forces never wanted you to know. Muammar Gaddafi was not born into wealth, privilege, or power. He came from the baking sands of the Libyan desert, where poverty was not a condition, it was the air everyone breathed. Born in a Bedouin tent in 1942, he spent his earliest years herding goats, sleeping on rough animal skins, and listening to stories of colonial rule. Libya at the time was still wrestling with the wounds left by Italian occupation, an era of brutality that left entire villages wiped out and tribal families shattered. Gaddafi absorbed these stories like fire. Even as a child, he could not forget them. He was only a boy when he first heard of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian president whose voice electrified the Arab world. Nasser preached freedom, unity, and resistance against Western domination. To young Gaddafi, Nasser was more than a leader, he was a vision of what an Arab man could be in a world designed to keep him small. It was around this time that Gaddafi began to dream, not childish fantasies, but a burning ambition to liberate Libya from the monarchy controlling it. By the time he entered middle school, teachers described him as unusually confident, almost unnervingly charismatic. He organized small groups of students into secret nationalist cells, and while others studied to pass exams, he studied the weaknesses of the government. He spent his teenage years traveling long distances on foot, living among nomadic tribes, absorbing their grievances and quietly building a network of loyal supporters, not soldiers but believers. His path seemed almost predetermined. He joined the military academy not because he craved the uniform, but because he understood that in a country under monarchy and foreign influence, real power flowed through the army. Within the academy's walls, Gaddafi formed a small clandestine group of young officers who shared one mission: the destruction of King Idris's regime. They were not just plotting a coup, they were plotting a revolution. In 1969, while King Idris was abroad receiving medical treatment, Gaddafi and his fellow officers seized their moment. With precision beyond their years and without a drop of blood spilled, they took control of key government buildings, communication centers, the Air Force Base, and Tripoli itself. When the sun rose the next morning, Libyans awoke to a new reality. The monarchy had fallen and a 27-year-old unknown captain now controlled the nation. The world was stunned. Western powers scrambled. Neighboring Arab nations celebrated. But the Libyan people, many of them took a cautious breath. Who was this young man who had toppled a king? Who gave him the right to rule? And what did he truly want? Gaddafi wasted no time answering. In his first speech, he declared Libya free from corruption, foreign manipulation, and the old order. He promised dignity, unity, and wealth for his people. Many dismissed him as too young, too bold, too untested. But within months, he began reshaping Libya in ways no one expected. He expelled foreign military bases from Libyan soil, nationalized oil, and redirected the profits into public welfare. Suddenly, a nation that had been one of the poorest in Africa began transforming. Schools opened. Healthcare became free. Housing projects rose from the desert. The Bedouin boy who once herded goats was now the architect of a new Libya. But for every ally he gained, he made a powerful enemy. Oil companies, intelligence agencies, Western governments, all began watching him closely. Gaddafi was not merely reforming Libya. He was repositioning the country on the world stage, and not in the way global powers preferred. The boy from the desert had become a leader of a revolution, and the seeds of future conflict had already been planted. Gaddafi's rise did not simply reshape Libya, it began to unsettle the global balance of power. Within a few years of taking control, he transformed the nation from an obscure desert kingdom into one of the most politically assertive countries in the Arab world. And he did it with a confidence bordering on defiance. Oil was his greatest weapon. Libya possessed the 9th largest oil reserves on Earth, and under the previous regime, most of the profits flowed straight into foreign pockets while Libyans lived in poverty. Gaddafi reversed this with one stroke. He nationalized the oil industry and forced multinational oil companies to renegotiate their contracts under Libya's terms, not theirs. It was unprecedented. A young African officer telling the world's most powerful oil corporations, If you want our oil, you will respect our sovereignty. And they obeyed. Almost overnight, Libya's national income multiplied many times over. The government used the money to fund massive development projects. Universities were built where none had existed. Illiteracy dropped dramatically. Rural areas received electricity and clean water for the first time in their history. Housing became a right, not a privilege. Medical care completely free. Education free from primary school to university, even abroad, fully funded by the state. Western analysts watched this transformation with growing suspicion. They expected Gaddafi to become another predictable dictator they could control. Instead, he became an anti-colonial symbol. He refused to join the Cold War as a pawn of the United States or the Soviet Union. He positioned Libya as an independent force, a third power in a world dominated by two giants. This independence made him popular across Africa and the Middle East, but it also made him dangerous in the eyes of the West. Then came his next move, one far more ambitious. Gaddafi quickly emerged as one of the loudest voices calling for Arab unity. Inspired by Nasser, he attempted multiple times to merge Libya with neighboring countries, Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, into a single powerful federation. Each attempt collapsed under political disagreements, but the message was clear. He was not content with transforming Libya alone. He wanted to reshape the entire Arab world. And when Arab unity failed, he turned toward Africa. The more Gaddafi traveled across the continent, the more he realized that Africa's weakness was not its people, but its division. He spoke passionately about the need for African nations to break free from Western financial dependence and to build their own economic networks. At a time when many African leaders still bent under the weight of colonial legacy, Gaddafi was unapologetically radical. He openly funded liberation movements, independence struggles, and resistance groups. From the ANC in South Africa, to revolutionary groups in Namibia, to fighters in Northern Ireland, to indigenous movements in the Philippines. Gaddafi's money found its way into hands fighting oppression across the globe. Some called it solidarity. Others called it chaos. Western governments called it a threat. His enemies began shaping a narrative around him, painting him as unstable, dangerous, unpredictable. Each move he made became ammunition for a growing campaign to isolate him internationally. But inside Libya, the story was very different. Libyans saw their country rising from poverty into one of the most advanced nations in Africa. They saw infrastructure, agriculture, industry, education, all rapidly improving. Women gained new rights, new freedoms, and new roles in society. The government launched ambitious projects like the Great Man-Made River, a colossal engineering achievement that transported fresh water from deep underground reservoirs across the desert, bringing life to entire regions. A project so massive, so beneficial, that some experts described it as the eighth wonder of the modern world. Yet, with every success, the pressure grew. Intelligence agencies watched. Diplomats whispered. Global powers calculated. Gaddafi was not playing by the rules they created, and in the world of geopolitics that was unforgivable. His next move would make him even more enemies. He began speaking openly about creating a single African currency backed by gold. A move that would challenge the US dollar, the French franc, and the entire Western-controlled financial system. He believed Africa deserved economic liberation, not just political independence. If Africa had its own currency, its own central bank, and its own financial structures, then Africa would no longer be controlled by foreign powers. For many Africans, this idea was revolutionary. For Western powers, it was intolerable. From the deserts of Libya, a young officer had become a global symbol of independence. But symbols, especially powerful ones, become targets. And Gaddafi was turning into the biggest target of all. The storm was coming, slowly, quietly, and with the force of nations far larger than Libya. Everything he had built, everything he had dreamed of, was about to be tested. The deeper Gaddafi pushed into African unification, the more fiercely global powers began to resist him. What he proposed was no small dream, it was a financial earthquake. He believed the time had come for Africa to break free from the shackles of European economic domination. He spoke openly, boldly, fearlessly about an African central bank, an African monetary fund, and a single African currency backed by gold from Libya's vast reserves. For decades, former colonial states had controlled African economies through debt, interest, and currency manipulation. Gaddafi was ready to destroy that entire structure. He had already pledged billions of dollars from Libyan reserves. And influential African leaders, from Mali to Senegal to South Africa, began nodding in agreement. But this was not merely an economic plan. This was a declaration of war against the global financial order. Western diplomats, economists, and intelligence agencies began sounding alarms behind closed doors. French officials panicked first. France maintained massive control over West Africa through the CFA franc, a colonial-era currency still used long after independence. Gaddafi's gold-backed dinar threatened to crumble France's entire influence overnight. The United States saw an even bigger danger, a united Africa operating outside the dollar system. A continent rich in minerals, oil, and rare earth metals. A continent with one currency, one bank, one voice. A continent that no longer borrowed from Europe or America. This, they decided, could not be allowed. And it wasn't just theory. Gaddafi was already writing checks. He funded African satellites to cut dependence on European telecommunication monopolies, a project that saved Africa billions annually. He pushed for highway systems connecting the continent. He sent engineers, doctors, and teachers to dozens of African nations. He financed agricultural revolutions in the Sahel. To the West, this was an empire. To Africa, it was liberation. But to the men who controlled the world's money, this was a threat that had to be neutralized. The first phase of the plan began quietly. Western media started shifting their stories about Gaddafi. One year they called him a madman. The next they portrayed him as a reformer. Sometimes they labeled him a terrorist. Sometimes a visionary. The goal was not clarity, the goal was confusion. Make the world unsure. Make allies doubt him. Make enemies emboldened. Then came a far more dangerous weapon, sanctions. Libya was accused of sponsoring the Lockerbie bombing, a tragedy involving Pan Am Flight 103. Later investigations would reveal layers of political pressure, contradictory testimony, and hidden motivations. But at the time, the accusation was enough. Libya was isolated. Gaddafi was forced to hand over suspects, pay billions in settlement money, and endure economic punishment that crippled entire sectors. He complied, not out of guilt but strategy. He believed that if he made peace with the West, Libya could re-enter the international community stronger than before. And for a while it worked. He met with European leaders. Condoleezza Rice visited him. Tony Blair met him inside his tent. Western oil companies signed new deals. But even as handshakes flashed before cameras, the plan against him continued behind the scenes. Intelligence agencies monitored every African meeting, every gold shipment, every speech about financial independence, every diplomatic move. Allies who once admired him were suddenly pressured. Some were bribed. Some were threatened. Some were turned against him. By the late 2000s, Gaddafi felt the walls closing in. Still, he refused to step back. He pushed harder. He poured more money into African development, more support into independence movements, more ambition into the gold-backed dinar. Then, a spark ignited, thousands of miles away, that would change everything. Tunisia erupted. Egypt followed. The Arab Spring began sweeping across the region like a storm of fire. What started as genuine demands for reform quickly turned into a geopolitical battlefield. Foreign funding flowed into select groups. Online propaganda campaigns multiplied. Entire nations slipped into chaos. And then, the storm reached Libya. But Libya was different. Libya was the prize. Foreign powers had been waiting for this moment, a window to intervene disguised as humanitarian concern but motivated by deeper agendas. Almost overnight, the world's most powerful nations turned their full attention toward Gaddafi. The narrative was set. The plan was in motion. The trap was closing. And Gaddafi, the man who once had the world eating from his hand, was now surrounded. But he would not fall quietly. He promised that he would die on Libyan soil. He promised he would never flee. He promised he would face whatever came, even if it took his last breath. The final battle was approaching. And the world would soon learn that they were not watching a simple uprising. They were witnessing the dismantling of a leader who dared to challenge global power. When the first protests erupted in Libya, Gaddafi instantly recognized something that many outsiders did not. This was no spontaneous revolution. It was coordinated, loud, and organized in ways that did not match Libya's political reality. Armed groups appeared with weapons that had never existed in the country before. Foreign fighters were spotted among the crowds. Satellite phones, rare in Libya, were suddenly everywhere. This was not coincidence. This was preparation. Gaddafi addressed the nation, warning that Libya was under attack by external forces seeking to destroy its unity. He spoke with fire, insisting that Libya would not fall like Tunisia or Egypt. He urged citizens to defend the country, to protect their neighborhoods, to stand against infiltration. But outside Libya, a different narrative spread like wildfire. Western media broadcast images of chaos, painting Gaddafi as a brutal dictator slaughtering his own people. Reports circulated about mass killings, claims later proven to be exaggerated or fabricated. Human rights organizations issued statements without verifying sources. The world believed what it was told. And the United Nations acted. Within weeks, a no-fly zone was imposed. NATO jets filled the skies. What was originally framed as a humanitarian mission became a full military assault. Bombs rained down on Tripoli, Misrata, Sirte, and other cities. Government buildings were destroyed. Communications towers were hit. Military bases were annihilated. Libya had been thrown into a war it could not win. Gaddafi, surrounded by loyalists, refused to flee. He moved constantly, from bunker to bunker, from tent to safe house. But he remained inside the country. His enemies expected him to run. Instead, he appeared on television, promising Libyans he would fight until the end. Foreign leaders watched closely. To France, he was a threat to the CFA franc. To the US, he was a challenge to the dollar. To the UK, he was unpredictable. To NATO, he was an opportunity. To Africa, he was a protector. To Libya, he was both a father and a fighter. As NATO attacks intensified, Gaddafi fled the capital and headed toward his hometown of Sirte, the symbolic heart of his tribe. It was there he planned to make his final stand. Sirte became the most bombed city in the entire conflict. Thousands of civilians were killed. Streets turned to ashes. Buildings crumbled. Families hid underground as NATO strikes continued day and night. Still, Gaddafi held on. Inside Sirte, what remained of the Libyan military fought fiercely. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. The world was closing in, and everyone knew it. Journalists, spies, rebel fighters, and NATO officials monitored every movement. Then came the moment that sealed his fate. A U.S. drone spotted a convoy attempting to leave Sirte. Moments later, NATO jets fired missiles, destroying the vehicles and scattering survivors into the desert. Gaddafi was injured but alive. He crawled into a drainage pipe with a handful of loyal fighters. Surrounded, bleeding, exhausted, but defiant. Rebel fighters closed in. And what happened next was brutal. Dragged from the pipe. Beaten. Humiliated. Tortured. Shot. A leader who once stood before kings and presidents was executed in the dirt, recorded on cell phones and broadcast across the world. Some celebrated. Some mourned. Some watched in silence, understanding the deeper truth. This was not merely the death of a man. It was the silencing of a challenge to global power. But what came next was the part no one was prepared for. Libya did not become a democracy. It did not become peaceful. It did not become prosperous. Instead, it collapsed. The moment Gaddafi died, the country splintered into warring militias. Radical groups seized weapons from abandoned military bases. Kidnappings, executions, and slave markets emerged. Infrastructure crumbled. Electricity failed. Hospitals emptied. The nation with the highest standard of living in Africa descended into chaos overnight. Foreign powers, the same ones that claimed intervention was for humanitarian purposes, quietly withdrew, leaving Libyans to face the darkness alone. Africa felt the shockwave immediately. The gold-backed dinar vanished. The African Monetary Fund dissolved. The dream of financial independence was buried. The continent returned to borrowing from the West. Everything Gaddafi built, the roads, the projects, the dreams, became fragile, endangered, or erased. But even in death, his influence refused to disappear. Many African leaders now speak openly about the truth. Gaddafi was killed not because he oppressed Libya, but because he threatened global control. His gold, his vision, his independence, his refusal to bow. He was not perfect. He made mistakes. He had enemies inside and outside the country. But one fact cannot be denied. No African leader in modern history challenged the world's most powerful nations the way Gaddafi did. And when a man stands alone against empires, empires respond. He died in a drainage pipe. But his story lives wherever people resist oppression. Wherever nations seek independence. Wherever Africa remembers its stolen dreams. And you watching this, hearing this, learning this, you are part of that memory. Never forget the question. Who really killed Muammar Gaddafi? And what were they trying to stop? If this story opened your eyes, if it changed how you see Libya, Africa, and global power, then let the world know. Share this video, subscribe for more untold histories, and keep this truth alive. Because stories like this are erased on purpose, unless we keep telling them.